Sarah Martinez stepped out of the black sedan, her worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete courtyard of the Naval War College, and she could already feel dozens of eyes watching her from the dormitory windows above. At 28, she looked younger than her years, with shoulder-length dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing civilian clothes that did nothing to hint at her extraordinary background. The driver, a Navy petty officer, handed her a manila envelope. "Your orders and room assignment, ma'am. Building C, 3rd floor, room 312. Orientation starts at 800 tomorrow." Sarah nodded and signed the clipboard. As the sedan pulled away, she stood alone in the courtyard, taking in her new environment. The Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, was where the Navy sent its brightest officers for advanced strategic and tactical training. It was also where Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEAL Team 6 operative, was supposed to disappear. The official story was simple. Lieutenant Martinez was a logistics officer being transferred for advanced education before taking on a new assignment. Her personnel file had been carefully scrubbed, her commendations buried, her real service record locked away in classified files that required clearance levels most people would never see. As far as anyone at the War College knew, she was just another mid-level officer looking to advance her career. Sarah picked up her bag and walked toward Building C. The truth was far more complicated. 3 months ago, she had been Sarah Ghost Martinez, one of only a handful of women to ever complete SEAL training and the first to be assigned to Team 6. She had spent the last 6 years in the most dangerous corners of the world, conducting operations that would never appear in any newspaper or history book. She had been in Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, and places that didn't officially exist on any map. The hallway in Building C was typical of military housing, long, sterile, with doors marked only by numbers. Sarah found room 312 and used her key card to enter. The room was small but functional, 2 single beds, 2 desks, 2 wardrobes, and a shared bathroom. One bed was clearly already occupied, with personal items scattered around and military uniforms hanging in the open wardrobe. Sarah set her bag on the empty bed and began unpacking. She had learned to travel light during her years with the SEALs, and everything she owned fit easily into the small space. As she was arranging her few civilian clothes, the door opened. "You must be my new roommate?" A young woman entered, wearing the crisp white uniform of a Navy ensign. She was tall and athletic, with blonde hair styled in a perfect military bun and the confident bearing that came with being top of her class. "I'm Ensign Jennifer Walsh, fresh out of Annapolis." Sarah turned and extended her hand. "Lieutenant Sarah Martinez. Nice to meet you." Jennifer's handshake was firm, and her eyes quickly scanned Sarah's casual clothes and minimal belongings. "Logistics, right? I saw your name on the room roster. I'm in the accelerated leadership track. Been here 2 weeks already." There was something in Jennifer's tone that suggested she viewed herself as superior, which wasn't uncommon among academy graduates. They often looked down on officers who had come up through the enlisted ranks or specialized programs. Sarah had encountered this attitude before and had learned to let it slide off her. "That's right," Sarah said simply, looking forward to learning something new. Jennifer sat on her perfectly made bed and pulled out a tablet. "Fair warning, this place is pretty intense. The academic load is heavy and the social dynamics can be tricky. Most of the students here are either academy graduates or officers with significant leadership experience. The competition is fierce." Sarah nodded as she continued unpacking. "I'm sure I'll manage. The guys especially can be challenging. There's a group of Marine captains and Navy lieutenants who think they run the place. They call themselves the Alpha Squad, though not officially. They've made it pretty clear they think women don't belong in combat leadership roles." Jennifer's voice carried a hint of frustration. "They've been testing every woman who comes through here, trying to prove we can't handle the pressure." This caught Sarah's attention, though she kept her expression neutral. Testing how? Oh, they start small. Challenges to physical fitness competitions, debates about military strategy, putting us in impossible scenarios during group exercises. They act like it's all friendly competition, but they're really trying to make us look incompetent. Jennifer's jaw tightened. Last week, they challenged me to a combat simulation exercise. Made it seem like a great learning opportunity, then set up scenarios designed to make me fail. Sarah finished putting away her clothes and sat on her own bed. How did that go? I held my own, but barely. These guys have real combat experience. Captain Richards served 3 tours in Iraq. Lieutenant Commander Brooks was on a destroyer in the Persian Gulf. Captain Stone is Force Recon Marine who's seen action in Syria. Jennifer shook her head. They know tactics I've only read about in textbooks. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She had probably seen more actual combat than all of them combined, but her official record showed none of it. Sounds like they take themselves pretty seriously. That's one way to put it. They've basically appointed themselves the unofficial gatekeepers of military competence around here. If you don't meet their standards, they make sure everyone knows it. Jennifer stood up and straightened her uniform. Anyway, I'm headed to the library to study. There's a tactical analysis exam tomorrow. You should probably start reviewing the course materials if you haven't already. After Jennifer left, Sarah lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling. She had hoped this assignment would be simple. Keep her head down, complete the program, and move on to whatever came next. The Navy had made it clear that her SEAL career was over. Too many close calls, too many operations that had pushed the boundaries of international law, too many questions being asked by oversight committees who didn't understand the reality of modern warfare. But even in retirement, she couldn't seem to escape conflict. The Alpha Squad that Jennifer had described sounded exactly like the kind of men she had dealt with throughout her military career. Competent, experienced, and absolutely convinced that women had no place in combat roles. They had probably never imagined that a woman could not only compete with them, but exceed their capabilities in every area that mattered. Sarah got up and walked to the window. Below, she could see groups of students walking across the campus grounds. Most were in uniform, moving with the purposeful stride of military officers. She spotted what had to be the Alpha Squad immediately, 5 men walking together, their bearing and confidence marking them as the self-appointed elite Jennifer had described. Captain Richards was easy to identify by his Army uniform and Ranger tab. He was tall and lean, with graying temples that suggested he was older than most students. Lieutenant Commander Brooks wore Navy dress blues with submarine warfare insignia. Captain Stone, the Marine, was shorter but powerfully built, with the kind of presence that commanded attention. The other 2 were harder to read from a distance, but they moved with the same confidence. As Sarah watched, they encountered a group of younger officers, including what looked like recent academy graduates. The interaction was brief, but Sarah could see the subtle dynamics at play. The way the younger officers deferred, the way the Alpha Squad members stood just a little too close, used their physical presence to dominate the conversation. Sarah had seen it all before. In her experience, the men who felt most threatened by capable women were usually those who suspected their own competence might not be as absolute as they claimed. Real professionals judged people by their abilities, not their gender. Those who made a point of testing women were usually trying to prove something to themselves as much as anyone else. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Welcome to War College. Hope you're ready for a real education. A friend." Sarah deleted the message and tossed the phone on her bed. She had 3 months to complete this program and move on with her life. 3 months to maintain her cover, avoid unnecessary attention, and resist the urge to show these self-appointed gatekeepers what real military competence looked like. She pulled out her course materials and began reading. The tactical analysis curriculum covered scenarios she had lived through, strategies she had implemented in real-world operations, and theoretical frameworks she had helped develop during classified debriefings. But according to her official record, she was just a logistics officer trying to learn something new. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah heard voices in the hallway outside her room. The walls were thin enough that conversations carried, and she couldn't help but overhear snippets of what sounded like planning. New logistics officer in 312. Another academy princess thinking she knows something. Time to see what she's really made of. Sarah smiled grimly and continued reading. It seemed the Alpha Squad had already noticed her arrival. They would probably start with something simple, a challenge to physical fitness maybe, or a debate about military strategy. They would want to establish dominance early, before she had time to settle in and find her footing. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The evening meal in the dining hall was exactly what Sarah had expected. Long tables filled with officers of various ranks, the buzz of conversation dominated by shop talk about assignments, career prospects, and the latest developments in military doctrine. Sarah found an empty spot at a table of logistics and administrative officers, people who matched her cover identity. The conversation was pleasant enough. Discussions of supply chain management, personnel policies, and the challenges of modernizing military bureaucracy. Sarah contributed just enough to seem engaged without drawing attention to herself. She was good at blending in when necessary, a skill that had served her well during undercover operations. Halfway through the meal, she sensed someone approaching from behind. She didn't turn around immediately, but her peripheral vision caught the reflection in the window. 3 men in uniform, moving with deliberate purpose. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Martinez?" The voice was confident, with a slight southern accent. Sarah turned to see Captain Richards standing with Lieutenant Commander Brooks and one of the other men she had observed from her window, a Navy lieutenant with pilot wings and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes?" Sarah kept her voice neutral and professional. "I'm Captain Richards, U.S. Army. This is Lieutenant Commander Brooks and Lieutenant Kowalski. We heard you just arrived and wanted to introduce ourselves." Richards extended his hand, and Sarah shook it briefly. "We like to welcome new students, especially those who might benefit from some guidance." The pause before guidance was deliberate, and Sarah caught the subtle condescension in his tone. "That's very kind of you. We run a little study group for tactical analysis," Lieutenant Commander Brooks said. "Informal discussions, practical exercises, that sort of thing. Really helps people get up to speed on the more challenging aspects of the curriculum. Especially for officers who might not have extensive operational experience," Lieutenant Kowalski added with that same false smile. Sarah nodded slowly. "I appreciate the offer. I'll keep it in mind." "The thing is," Captain Richards continued, "this program can be pretty demanding. The academic standards are high and the practical exercises can be intense. We'd hate to see a fellow officer struggle unnecessarily." The message was clear enough. They were offering to help, but the subtext was that they expected her to need help. They were positioning themselves as the experts and her as the student who should be grateful for their attention. "I'm sure I'll figure it out," Sarah replied. "But thank you for thinking of me." The 3 men exchanged glances. They had expected either eager acceptance or defensive hostility. Sarah's calm indifference seemed to throw them off balance. "Well," Captain Richards said finally, "the offer stands. We're always happy to help a colleague who knows her limitations." After they left, Sarah returned to her meal, aware that conversations at nearby tables had quieted as people observed the interaction. Word would spread quickly that the Alpha Squad had made contact with the new student. People would be watching to see how she responded to their inevitable escalation. Sarah finished eating and returned to her room to find Jennifer already there, books spread across her desk. I saw you talking to Captain Richards and his crew, Jennifer said without looking up from her notes. What did they want? They offered to help me with the coursework. Jennifer snorted. That's how it starts. Next, they'll invite you to some friendly competition, then gradually ramp up the pressure until you either quit or humiliate yourself trying to prove you belong. Sarah sat at her own desk and opened her course materials. What would you do in my position? Honestly? Keep your head down and avoid them as much as possible. This program is only 3 months. If you can get through it without giving them an excuse to target you, you'll be fine. Jennifer finally looked up. The problem is they don't always wait for an excuse. As Sarah studied late into the evening, she reflected on the strange position she found herself in. For 6 years, she had been among the most elite soldiers in the American military. She had conducted operations that required skills and training these men could only dream of. She had proven herself in ways that went far beyond anything they would ever face in their conventional military careers. But now she was supposed to be intimidated by their posturing and impressed by their credentials. She was supposed to play the role of the inexperienced female officer who needed their guidance and protection. Sarah closed her books and prepared for bed, already planning how she would handle tomorrow's inevitable escalation. The Alpha Squad had made their opening move, establishing their dominance and offering their protection. When she failed to show the proper gratitude or deference, they would move to the next phase. They thought they were dealing with just another logistics officer who needed to be put in her place. They had no idea how wrong they were. The next morning, Sarah arrived at her first tactical analysis class 15 minutes early. The classroom was already half full, with students claiming seats in what appeared to be an established hierarchy. The Alpha Squad sat in the back corner, their presence commanding attention even when they weren't speaking. Academy graduates clustered in the center sections, while the few remaining seats in the front were occupied by officers who seemed less confident or socially connected. Sarah chose a seat in the middle section, close enough to hear everything, but far enough from the Alpha Squad to avoid seeming either intimidated or confrontational. She opened her notebook and began reviewing the case study they would be discussing, a complex scenario involving insurgent operations in an urban environment. Professor Colonel Amanda Foster entered precisely at 800, her bearing crisp and professional. She was one of the few women on the War College faculty, a former intelligence officer who had earned her position through exceptional analytical skills and operational experience. Sarah had done her research on all the instructors and knew that Colonel Foster demanded excellence from her students. Today we'll be analyzing Operation Phantom Thunder, Colonel Foster announced, pulling up a detailed map on the projection screen. This was a complex counterinsurgency operation conducted in Iraq in 2007. Multiple units, civilian populations, unclear enemy positions, and significant political constraints. She began outlining the scenario, but Sarah was already familiar with the operation. She had studied it extensively during her SEAL training, and several of her former teammates had participated in related missions. The complexity that made it perfect for academic analysis also made it incredibly dangerous for the soldiers involved. Lieutenant Martinez, Colonel Foster said suddenly, catching Sarah off guard. What would you identify as the primary challenge in this scenario? The question was clearly intended to test the new student, possibly at the suggestion of other faculty who had been briefed on her background, or lack thereof. Sarah considered her options carefully. She could give a safe, textbook answer that demonstrated basic competence without revealing deeper knowledge, or she could provide the kind of insight that only came from real-world experience. Intelligence gaps, Sarah replied after a moment. The forces had incomplete information about enemy strength, civilian sympathies, and the physical terrain. In a situation like this, assumptions become the primary threat multiplier. Colonel Foster nodded approvingly. Expand on that. Traditional intelligence gathering methods were compromised because the enemy had integrated with the civilian population, Local sources couldn't be trusted, aerial reconnaissance had limitations in urban terrain, and electronic surveillance was being actively countered. Sarah paused, aware that she was drawing on knowledge that went beyond what a logistics officer should possess. Without reliable intelligence, even the best tactical plans become guesswork. Interesting perspective, Lieutenant. Have you encountered similar challenges in your own experience? It was a loaded question. Sarah's official record showed no combat deployments or operational assignments where she would have faced such challenges. Only in training scenarios and case studies, ma'am, but the principle seems consistent across different operational environments. Behind her, Sarah heard Captain Stone whisper something to his companions. The Marine had been watching her carefully, and she could sense his skepticism about her answer. Colonel Foster continued the discussion, calling on other students to analyze different aspects of the operation. Captain Richards provided a solid analysis of the logistical challenges, while Lieutenant Commander Brooks discussed naval support operations. When she called on Captain Stone, his response was sharp and detailed, drawing on what was clearly extensive ground combat experience. The real problem, Stone concluded, was that the planners underestimated the enemy's adaptability. They assumed insurgent tactics would remain static, but the enemy evolved their methods based on our responses. It became a chess match where we were always one move behind. An excellent observation, Captain. Does anyone want to respond to that assessment? Sarah felt the subtle pressure to remain silent, to let the more experienced officers dominate the discussion. But something in Stone's analysis bothered her, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Captain Stone makes a valid point about enemy adaptability, Sarah said carefully. But I think the real issue was that our forces were trying to fight a conventional war against an unconventional enemy. The insurgents weren't playing chess. They were changing the rules of the game entirely. The classroom fell silent. Every eye was on Sarah, and she could feel the intensity of the Alpha Squad's attention like a physical weight. Stone turned in his chair to face her directly. That's an interesting theory, Lieutenant. But how exactly would you fight an enemy that keeps changing the rules? The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't academic discussion anymore, it was a test of her competence and confidence. You stop trying to impose your rules on them, Sarah replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Instead of forcing them to fight the way you want to fight, you adapt your methods to neutralize their advantages. Small unit operations, extended surveillance, building genuine relationships with local populations rather than relying on informants who may have divided loyalties. Small unit operations? Lieutenant Kowalski spoke up from the back. How small are we talking about? Sarah realized she was walking into dangerous territory. The kind of operations she was describing were exactly the type conducted by SEAL teams and other special operations units. Small enough to move undetected, large enough to be effective. The exact size would depend on the mission parameters and local conditions. Have you studied special operations tactics, Lieutenant? Colonel Foster asked, her curiosity clearly piqued. Only at a basic level, ma'am. But the principles seem applicable to conventional forces operating in similar environments. Captain Richards leaned forward in his seat. The logistics of supporting small unit operations in hostile territory are incredibly complex. How would you maintain supply lines and communication without compromising operational security? He was testing her technical knowledge now, probably expecting her to stumble over details that only experienced operators would know. Sarah considered her response carefully. Pre-positioned assets, diversified communication methods, and redundant extraction plans, she said. The key is minimizing dependence on traditional support structures that can be compromised or cut off. The answer was correct, but it was also more detailed than a logistics officer should know without specific training. Sarah saw Colonel Foster making notes, and she realized her cover might be slipping. Impressive knowledge base, Lieutenant, Stone said. his tone suggesting suspicion rather than admiration. "Where exactly did you acquire such detailed understanding of special operations procedures?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the weight of every person in the room waiting for her answer. She had two choices: retreat and admit she was out of her depth, or continue the conversation and risk exposing herself further. Military doctrine courses, professional development programs, and extensive reading, she replied. "I find the subject interesting." It was technically true, though it left out the small detail that her professional development had included 6 years of conducting those exact operations. Stone wasn't satisfied with the answer. Reading about something and actually doing it are very different things. Real operations involve factors that don't appear in any manual or case study, such as fear, exhaustion, equipment failure, weather, the smell of cordite and blood, the weight of making life or death decisions with incomplete information while people are shooting at you. His voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through such experiences. No amount of academic study can prepare you for that reality. Sarah nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right, Captain. Academic knowledge is no substitute for real experience." The admission seemed to satisfy Stone, and the tension in the room eased slightly. But Sarah caught Colonel Foster watching her with increased interest. The professor had noticed something in her responses that didn't quite fit the image of a typical logistics officer. After class, Sarah packed her materials and headed for the door, hoping to avoid further confrontation. But Captain Richards intercepted her in the hallway. "That was an interesting discussion, Lieutenant," he said, falling into step beside her. "You seem to have quite an extensive knowledge of tactical operations for a logistics officer." "I believe in being well-rounded in my professional education," Sarah replied without breaking stride. "Admirable. In fact, my colleagues and I were just discussing how we might help you apply some of that theoretical knowledge in a more practical setting." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. "What did you have in mind?" "We run regular training exercises. Nothing official, just voluntary sessions to keep our skills sharp. Physical fitness, tactical scenarios, leadership challenges. It's a good way for officers to test themselves in a controlled environment." Lieutenant Commander Brooks appeared from around the corner, along with Captain Stone and the other 2 members of their group. It wasn't a coincidence. They had planned this encounter. "We thought you might be interested in joining us for this weekend's exercise," Brooks said. "It's a capture-the-flag scenario in the woods about an hour from campus. Good opportunity to put some of those tactical theories into practice." Sarah understood exactly what was happening. They had listened to her responses in class and decided she was getting too confident, too vocal. The exercise would be designed to humble her, to prove that academic knowledge was worthless without real experience. "What kind of exercise exactly?" "Standard military training," Stone replied. "Teams of 5, each trying to capture the other's flag while defending their own position. Non-lethal ammunition, safety protocols, realistic terrain. It's actually a lot of fun once you get into it." Lieutenant Kowalski smiled. "Of course, if you're not comfortable with that kind of physical challenge, no one would blame you for sitting this one out. Not everyone is cut out for field operations." The challenge was clear, and Sarah could see that they expected her to decline. A smart logistics officer would make excuses about not being properly trained for such activities. "Sounds interesting," Sarah said. "What equipment do I need?" The 5 men exchanged glances. They had expected hesitation, not immediate acceptance. "Just field gear and your personal equipment," Richards said. "We provide the training weapons and safety gear. Meet at 600 Saturday at the main gate." "I'll be there." As Sarah walked away, she heard one of them say something under his breath that made the others chuckle. She didn't need to hear the exact words to know they were discussing how they would handle their overconfident recruit. That evening, Jennifer was studying at her desk when Sarah returned to their room. "How was your first day of classes?" "Educational," Sarah replied, sitting down to review her notes. I got invited to join a training exercise this weekend. Jennifer looked up from her books, alarm evident on her face. Please tell me you didn't accept an invitation from Captain Richards and his crew. I did. Sarah, that's exactly what they want. They'll set up scenarios designed to make you fail, then use your performance to prove that women don't belong in combat leadership roles. Jennifer closed her book and turned to face her roommate. I made the mistake of participating in one of their exercises last month. They had me try to plan an assault on a defended position with inadequate intelligence and insufficient resources. When I failed to achieve the objective, they spent the rest of the exercise explaining why women lack the aggressive instincts necessary for combat leadership. What would have been the correct approach? There wasn't one. That was the point. They design impossible scenarios, then blame the participant for not achieving impossible objectives. Sarah considered this information. What if someone did achieve the objective? They'd move the goalposts, change the rules, add complications that weren't part of the original briefing. Jennifer shook her head. These guys aren't interested in fair competition. They want to prove a point about female competence in military roles. Or incompetence. Exactly. And you just volunteered to be their next demonstration. Sarah continued reviewing her class notes, but her mind was already working through potential scenarios for the weekend exercise. The Alpha Squad thought they were dealing with an inexperienced logistics officer who had gotten too confident after demonstrating some theoretical knowledge. They were planning to teach her a lesson about the difference between classroom learning and real-world application. They had no idea that the woman they were trying to humble had more real-world combat experience than all of them combined. While they had been serving in conventional military roles, following established protocols and working within traditional command structures, Sarah had been operating in the shadows, conducting missions that required creativity, adaptability, and skills they couldn't imagine. The exercise would be interesting. The Alpha Squad expected to demonstrate their superiority over a woman they viewed as unqualified and overconfident. Instead, they were about to encounter someone who could outthink, outfight, and outmaneuver them in ways that would challenge everything they believed about military competence. Sarah's only concern was maintaining her cover. She needed to perform well enough to earn their respect without revealing skills that would raise questions about her background. It would require careful calibration, showing enough competence to silence their condescension while maintaining the fiction that she was just a logistics officer with good instincts. Friday evening, Sarah made her preparations. Her equipment loadout was carefully chosen. Standard gear that any competent officer might possess, nothing that would suggest specialized training or experience. She spent time reviewing maps of the local area, identifying likely terrain features that might be used for the exercise. Most importantly, she spent time thinking through the psychological aspects of the weekend. The Alpha Squad wanted to prove a point about female competence in combat roles. They would be watching for signs of weakness, hesitation, or incompetence that they could use to support their preconceptions. Sarah had spent years working with men who held similar attitudes. Some had eventually learned to respect her capabilities, while others had never moved beyond their initial prejudices. The key was demonstrating competence without triggering the kind of defensive reactions that made rational assessment impossible. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on the strange irony of her situation. 3 months ago, she had been one of the most elite soldiers in the American military. Now she was preparing to prove herself to a group of conventional officers who believed they represented the pinnacle of military competence. Tomorrow would be interesting. Saturday morning arrived with a light fog that clung to the trees surrounding the training area. Sarah stood at the main gate at precisely 0600, wearing standard field gear and carrying a basic military pack. She had deliberately chosen equipment that looked worn but well-maintained, the gear of someone who took care of their equipment without having access to the latest specialized items. The Alpha Squad arrived in 2 vehicles, their equipment noticeably more extensive and expensive than hers. Captain Stone emerged from the lead vehicle wearing full tactical gear that would have been appropriate for an actual combat deployment. The others were similarly equipped, their loadouts suggesting they took these exercises very seriously. "Glad you decided to join us, Lieutenant," Captain Richards said, shouldering a pack that looked like it weighed twice what Sarah was carrying. "Hope you're ready for a challenging day." Lieutenant Commander Brooks handed her a training weapon, a modified rifle that fired paint rounds instead of live ammunition. "Safety protocols are simple. No headshots, no shots at less than 10 feet, and no physical contact between participants. Medical personnel will be on standby, and we have radio communication with base if anything goes wrong." Sarah examined the weapon quickly and efficiently, checking its action and sighting system. It was a quality training tool, well-maintained and properly zeroed. "Rules of engagement? Capture the flag," Captain Stone explained, pointing toward a wooded area about half a mile away. "2 teams, 5 members each. Flags are positioned approximately 1 kilometer apart. First team to capture the enemy flag and return it to their base wins." "Teams?" "You'll be with Lieutenants Morrison and Phillips," Lieutenant Kowalski said, indicating 2 younger officers who had arrived separately. "Plus Ensign Walsh and Lieutenant Kumar." Sarah recognized Jennifer among the group and nodded to her. The other team members looked nervous. Clearly, they understood this was more than a friendly training exercise. "The experienced team starts from the north position," Richards continued. "You'll start from the south. Terrain is mixed. Open areas, dense forest, some elevation changes. Exercise begins in 30 minutes. As the teams separated to reach their starting positions, Jennifer fell into step beside Sarah. "I can't believe you actually came," she whispered. "Do you have any idea what we're walking into?" "Enlighten me." "Last month, they ran a similar exercise with 3 female officers. The scenario was designed to be impossible. The experienced team started with better positions, more equipment, and advanced knowledge of the terrain. When we failed to achieve the objective, they spent an hour explaining why the result proved women lacked the tactical instincts necessary for combat leadership." Lieutenant Morrison, a young Naval Academy graduate, overheard the conversation. "Are you saying this isn't a legitimate training exercise?" "It's legitimate," Sarah replied, "but I suspect the learning objectives aren't what they appear to be." She studied the terrain ahead of them as they walked. Dense forest provided excellent concealment but limited visibility. Open areas offered better observation but left them exposed. The scattered hills would create natural defensive positions while channeling movement through predictable routes. "What's our plan?" Lieutenant Phillips asked. He was an Army logistics officer, probably chosen for the team because his background matched Sarah's cover identity. "Let's see what we're working with first," Sarah said. "Jennifer, what kind of tactical training have you had?" "Basic combat skills at the academy, some leadership exercises, nothing extensive." "Morrison?" "Same, plus some shipboard security training." "Phillips?" "Army logistics training, basic field operations. I can handle myself, but I'm not exactly special operations material." "Kumar?" Lieutenant Kumar, an Air Force officer, shrugged. "Flight training, survival courses, basic combat skills. I can shoot, but ground tactics aren't exactly my specialty." Sarah assessed their situation. 5 officers with minimal tactical training, facing 5 experienced combat veterans who had designed the exercise to demonstrate their superiority. The terrain favored the team that could move quietly and strike quickly, but the Alpha Squad would expect them to attempt a direct assault. They reached their starting position, a small clearing marked with orange flags. Their objective flag was planted in the center, a red banner attached to a 6-foot pole. According to the exercise parameters, they needed to defend this position while simultaneously capturing the Alpha Squad's flag from their position 1 kilometer north. 30 minutes to plan, Sarah announced, checking her watch. Let's talk strategy. The team gathered around her, and Sarah knelt to sketch a rough map in the dirt. Standard approach would be to leave 2 people here to defend our flag and send 3 north to capture theirs. That's what they expect, and it's exactly how they want us to think. What's the alternative? Morrison asked. We abandon this position entirely. The suggestion drew startled looks from her teammates. Abandon our flag? Phillips asked. Isn't the point to defend it? The point is to win, Sarah corrected. The rules say we have to capture their flag and return it to our base. They don't say we have to defend our flag against attack. Jennifer was following Sarah's logic. You want to concentrate all our forces for the assault. More than that. I want to make this exercise about something other than tactical competence. Sarah looked at each team member carefully. They've designed this to prove that inexperienced officers can't handle complex tactical scenarios. But what if we change the nature of the scenario entirely? She began outlining a plan that drew on principles her SEAL team had used in countless operations. Misdirection, speed, and exploiting enemy assumptions. The Alpha Squad would expect a conventional approach because that's what their experience had taught them to expect. They would deploy their forces to defend against predictable attacks and counter obvious strategies. This is going to require precise timing and absolute trust, Sarah concluded. Everyone needs to do exactly what they're assigned to do, exactly when they're supposed to do it. No improvisation, no second-guessing. Can you handle that? The 4 officers looked at each other uncertainly. The plan Sarah had outlined was unlike anything they had learned in their military education. It required skills they weren't sure they possessed, and coordination that seemed almost impossible to achieve. What if it doesn't work? Kumar asked. Then we lose, and they get to prove their point about female officers being unqualified for combat leadership, Sarah replied bluntly. But if we try to beat them at their own game, we're guaranteed to lose anyway. At least this way we have a chance. Morrison nodded slowly. What do you need us to do? The next 20 minutes were spent in intensive preparation. Sarah assigned each team member specific tasks, walking them through their roles until she was confident they understood both the plan and their individual responsibilities. She was careful to frame her instructions as suggestions rather than orders, maintaining the fiction that she was just another inexperienced officer working through the problem logically. At 0700 precisely, Captain Richards's voice came over the radio. Exercise begins now. Good hunting. Sarah's team immediately moved out, abandoning their flag position and heading north through the forest. The plan required them to reach the Alpha Squad's position before the veterans realized what was happening and repositioned their forces. Jennifer and Phillips took point, moving through the trees with surprising stealth for officers with minimal field training. Sarah had given them simple but effective techniques for quiet movement, and they were following her instructions precisely. Morrison and Kumar flanked wide to the east, their job to create a distraction that would draw the Alpha Squad's attention away from the main approach. They had been given specific timing for their demonstration, designed to coincide with the primary assault. Sarah moved alone through the center, using terrain features and natural concealment to remain invisible while maintaining visual contact with the enemy position. This was the role that required the most skill, and she had kept it for herself to avoid raising questions about her teammates' capabilities. Within 15 minutes, she had located the Alpha Squad's defensive position. They had chosen well, a small hill that provided clear observation in all directions, with their flag positioned at the summit and defended by prepared positions. Captain Stone and Lieutenant Kowalski were visible in fighting positions that covered the most likely approach routes. But the position also had a weakness that Sarah recognized immediately. The defenders were positioned to repel attacks from the south, assuming their opponents would advance directly from their starting position. The eastern approach was covered by a single observer, and the western approach was deemed too difficult to traverse. Sarah keyed her radio once, the signal for Morrison and Kumar to begin their distraction. 30 seconds later, she heard the sound of paint rounds being fired from the eastern side of the hill. Voices shouted orders, and she could see the Alpha Squad repositioning to meet what they assumed was the primary assault. That's when Jennifer and Phillips struck from the west. The two junior officers had circled wide through terrain the Alpha Squad considered impassable, approaching the flag position from the one direction that wasn't properly defended. They moved with the confidence that came from following a plan they understood completely, even if they didn't fully comprehend how Sarah had known it would work. Captain Richards's voice came over the radio, tight with frustration. "Contact west. They're on the objective." But it was too late. By the time the Alpha Squad realized what was happening, Jennifer had reached the flag and Phillips was providing cover for her withdrawal. The distraction team had done their job perfectly, drawing the defenders' attention long enough for the real assault to succeed. Sarah watched from concealment as the veterans scrambled to respond to a situation they hadn't anticipated. These were competent, experienced officers, but they had been outmaneuvered by a plan that exploited their assumptions about what their opponents were capable of. "Flag captured," Jennifer's voice came over the radio, breathless with excitement and disbelief. "Moving to extraction point." The next phase of the operation required the team to return the captured flag to their starting position while avoiding pursuit. This was where Sarah's planning showed its true sophistication. She had anticipated the Alpha Squad's likely response and developed countermeasures that kept her team ahead of their pursuers. 20 minutes later, Jennifer planted the Alpha Squad's flag at their abandoned base position, officially ending the exercise. The inexperienced team had achieved total victory without losing a single member. Captain Stone was the first to reach the finish point, his face flushed with exertion and something that might have been embarrassment. "How the hell did you do that?" Sarah looked at her teammates, all of whom were grinning with the satisfaction of having exceeded their own expectations. "Teamwork, good planning, and maybe a little luck." "That wasn't luck," Captain Richards said, arriving with the rest of the Alpha Squad. "That was professional-level tactical execution. Where did you learn to plan operations like that?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah realized she had reached the moment she had been trying to avoid. Her performance had been too good, too sophisticated for a logistics officer with no operational experience. Either she revealed something closer to the truth, or she maintained her cover and accepted that these men would spend the rest of the program trying to figure out her secret. "I told you I find the subject interesting," Sarah replied. "I've done a lot of reading and theoretical study." Lieutenant Commander Brooks shook his head. "Reading doesn't teach you how to exploit terrain features or coordinate complex timing sequences. That was real operational planning." Colonel Foster emerged from the tree line where she had been observing the exercise. "Indeed it was. Lieutenant Martinez, could I speak with you privately?" Sarah felt her stomach drop. The professor had been watching, evaluating not just the exercise, but Sarah's performance specifically. There would be questions now, inquiries into her background that might reveal information she wasn't supposed to share. They walked away from the group, and Colonel Foster waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. "That was impressive tactical work, Lieutenant. The kind of planning and execution I'd expect from someone with extensive special operations experience." Sarah maintained her composure. "Thank you, ma'am. I've been reviewing your personnel file since our discussion in class yesterday. Interesting reading. Or rather, interesting for what it doesn't contain." Colonel Foster's eyes were sharp with intelligence. 6 years of classified assignments, fitness reports that are mostly redacted, training records that reference programs that don't officially exist. The professor knew. Sarah could see it in her expression, the recognition of someone who understood what those gaps in the official record meant. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, Lieutenant. I'm stating that your background is considerably more complex than your cover identity suggests." Colonel Foster glanced back toward the Alpha Squad, who were still trying to process their defeat. The question is whether you're going to continue this charade for the next 3 months, or if we can find a way for you to contribute your real expertise to this program. Sarah considered her options. The Navy had sent her here to disappear, to complete a routine educational program while they figured out what to do with an operator whose career had become too complicated for continued active duty. Revealing her true background would create exactly the kind of attention she was supposed to avoid, but she was tired of pretending to be less than she was. Tired of letting men like the Alpha Squad assume she was incompetent based on their prejudices about women in combat roles. Tired of hiding skills and experience that could actually help train the next generation of military leaders. What did you have in mind, Colonel? A more honest conversation about tactical operations. Real scenarios based on actual missions rather than theoretical exercises. The kind of instruction that could benefit from someone who's actually conducted the operations we're studying. Colonel Foster paused, watching Sarah's face carefully. These officers are going to be leading soldiers in real combat situations. They deserve training from someone who understands what that actually means. Sarah looked back at her teammates, who were still celebrating their victory, and at the Alpha Squad, who were engaged in intense discussion about what had gone wrong with their plan. All of them were competent officers who would someday be responsible for the lives of soldiers under their command. They deserved the best training available, even if it meant compromising her carefully constructed cover. I'd need assurance that my actual background would remain confidential. You'd have it. This conversation would be between us, and any additional instruction you provided would be presented as guest expertise rather than personal experience. Colonel Foster smiled slightly. The Navy didn't send you here to hide, Lieutenant. They sent you here to transition to a new role. This could be the beginning of that transition. Captain Stone approached them, clearly struggling with his team's defeat. Colonel Foster, I have to ask, did you provide Lieutenant Martinez with advance intelligence about this exercise? No, Captain. Lieutenant Martinez achieved her victory through superior tactical planning and execution. With respect, ma'am, that level of operational sophistication doesn't develop through classroom study. Someone taught her those techniques. Sarah stepped forward. Captain, would it matter if they had? The exercise was designed to test tactical competence under pressure. My team demonstrated that competence and achieved the objective. But where did you learn? The same place you learned to conduct ground operations in Iraq, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a new edge of authority. Through training, experience, and working with people who knew more than I did. The only difference is that my experience doesn't appear on my official service record. The statement hung in the air like a revelation. Captain Stone's eyes widened as the implications became clear, and Sarah could see understanding dawning on the faces of the other Alpha Squad members. Your special operations, Lieutenant Commander Brooks said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at Colonel Foster, who nodded almost imperceptibly. I'm Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, she said simply. And for the past 6 years, my job has been to conduct operations that officially never happened in places that officially don't exist. My teammates called me Ghost, and I've seen more combat than all of you combined. The silence that followed was profound. The Alpha Squad stood frozen, realizing that they had been testing someone whose qualifications exceeded their own in every category they claimed to value. The junior officers who had been on Sarah's team looked at her with new understanding of why their impossible victory had felt so achievable. Captain Richards was the first to find his voice. Navy SEALs? Team 6, Sarah confirmed. The admission changed everything. SEAL Team 6 was legendary even among special operations units, the elite of the elite. Operators who were selected from the best of an already exceptional community. The idea that they had been condescending to someone from that background was almost incomprehensible. Why didn't you tell us? Lieutenant Kowalski asked. Because I wasn't supposed to. My career with the teams is over, and I'm here to transition to a new role. The Navy preferred that I maintain a low profile while completing this program. But we were testing me, challenging my competence, trying to prove I didn't belong in combat leadership roles. Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. All based on assumptions about what women are capable of in military service. Captain Stone stepped forward, and Sarah could see the struggle on his face. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We had no idea that I was qualified. Or that women could be qualified? Sarah asked pointedly. Because one of those assumptions is more problematic than the other. The captain's face flushed. Both, I guess. We were wrong on both counts. Colonel Foster cleared her throat. I think this experience has been educational for everyone involved. The question now is how we move forward. Sarah looked at each member of the Alpha Squad, seeing genuine respect in their expressions for the first time. I propose we treat each other as professional military officers and evaluate competence based on performance rather than preconceptions. I think we've all learned something today about the danger of making assumptions. Captain Richards extended his hand. Agreed. And if you're willing, we'd be honored to learn from your experience. As they walked back toward the vehicles, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For 3 months, she had been planning to hide who she was and what she had accomplished. Now, she realized there might be another path forward, one where she could use her experience to make the next generation of military leaders more effective. Jennifer fell into step beside her. So, my roommate is a Navy SEAL. Former Navy SEAL, Sarah corrected. Now I'm just another student trying to figure out what comes next. Somehow I doubt that, Jennifer said with a grin. Something tells me you're going to find a way to make whatever comes next pretty interesting. Sarah smiled, looking ahead to the uncertain but promising future. We'll see. The morning fog had lifted and the sun was shining through the trees. For the first time since arriving at the War College, Sarah felt like she could see the path ahead clearly. It wouldn't be the path she had originally planned, but it might be exactly the path she needed.